Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liz Deepers, and I'll be hosting this webinar on behalf of Aracy today. Thank you for joining us. Today on unceded sovereign lands of Aboriginal people, we acknowledge the traditional custodians and their enduring connection to its lands, water, skies. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples. In solidarity, Aracy supports the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the need for truth-telling about the history and impact of colonisation. We treasure the rich and diverse cultures and customs of First Nations people, the valued knowledge holders, leaders and partners in creating the conditions for all children to thrive. I'm coming to you today from Dharawal Nation, and I encourage you to acknowledge the country you're joining us from today in the chat. So during this webinar, your mics and cameras will remain off for the session. You'll be able to add questions by the Q&A in the control panel at the top of the Teams webinar window. Please feel free to post questions at any time, and we'll be having a Q&A at the end. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Aracy website and YouTube channel. Today, we're hosting the winter webinar for the Aracy Longitudinal Studies Collaborative, titled Before the First 1,000 Days, How the Life Histories of Parents May Shape the Next Generation. Aracy has an extensive history with the Longitudinal Studies Collaborative, and we're pleased to provide ongoing support, helping to connect people to the work and research outcomes. Today, we'll be hearing key insights from three of the chief investigators in the Intergenerational Cohort Consortium. We have Craig Olsen, Primrose Letcher, and Kimberly Thompson. Craig is a developmental scientist specialising in population-based longitudinal studies of social and emotional development across the lifespan. He holds an NHMRC Fellowship in Life Course Epidemiology, is the current Scientific Director of the Australian Temperament Project Generation 3 study, and leads the Intergenerational Cohort Consortium. He co-convenes the Aracy Longitudinal Study Collaborative and is founding convener of the MCRI Life Course Initiative in Victoria. Primrose is a senior clinical psychologist and deputy director of the Australian Temperament Project, its Generation 3 study, investigating social and emotional development from infancy to adulthood and into the next generation. Both her research and clinical work is dedicated to her interest in internalising disorders, mental health and well-being, and caregiving across the lifespan. Kimberly Thompson is an assistant professor in the Children's Health Policy Centre at Simon Fraser University. Kimberly's research investigates social context factors within children's early environments that are associated with future mental health and well-being throughout the life course and into the next generation. She is particularly interested in research that informs policy and has worked with child development monitoring teams in British Columbia and Australia to embed routinely collected population child health monitoring data into policy and practice. I welcome them all today, and it's up to you guys.
All right. Well, thank you. Can I just confirm you can see that all okay? All good? All right. Well, thanks, Liz, and welcome everyone to the third Aracy LSC webinar in our 2024 series. It's great to see so many of you online today. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the LSC was established by Professors Fiona Stanley and Anne Sanson in 2006 with the multiple aims of raising awareness of cohorts in our region, advocating for longitudinal research generally, facilitating translation into policy and practice through the mechanisms of Aracy, building life course research capacity, particularly in our early to mid-career researchers, and disseminating findings to a wide audience. And a key part of the Aracy LSC has been the development of a web-based cohort directory that now lists over 55 cohort studies involving over 70,000 participants, spanning 50 years of research activity across Australia and New Zealand. And our purpose in setting up this lunchtime webinar series, which commenced at the start of the year, has been to specifically showcase new cross-cohort consortia that have been emerging in the set with the aim of further maximising the value of existing cohort data we have. The first webinar series we had at the beginning of the year was led by Dr. Meredith O'Connor from the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and focused on cross-cohort work addressing social determinants of inequality seen across COVID. The second, led by Dr. Chris Greenwood, showcased a consortium that has been more recently established to better understand pathways to illicit substance use across adolescence and young adulthood. And in October, we will hear from Dr. Jess Hurd about a new cross-cohort consortium addressing pathways to housing insecurity and homelessness. But for today's webinar, as Liz mentioned, I'm joined by Dr. Primrose Letcher from Deakin University and Dr. Kim Thompson from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver to showcase what we call the Australian and New Zealand Intergenerational Cohort Consortium, otherwise known as the ICC, which brings together 3 of the longest running cohorts in our region that are now old enough to be tracking the health and development of next generation offspring, which is really a remarkable achievement, testimony to endurance and longevity of research teams as much as the projects. The ICC was initially set up in 2019 with funding from the Australian Research Council Discovery Project scheme. And the aim of that grant was to systematically look at the extent to which exposures occurring in one generation across childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood shape the health and development of the next generation. So over the next half hour or so, we will describe the studies within the ICC, provide a high level, what we might call a view from the ridge digest of some of the major intergenerational findings emerging from the work to date, and conclude with an approach to breaking intergenerational cycles in partnership with local communities that we've been piloting and exploring. And if this all tracks the schedule, we should have about 5 minutes for questions at the end, after which you will hopefully have had some lunch and can get back to your day. So the first 1,000 days of life are now well recognised as being fundamental to healthy development across the lifespan, and so much so that there's now an entire field of scientific inquiry dedicated to this period, known as the Developmental Origins of Health and Disease Framework or Paradigm. The work of the ICC builds on the DOHAD framework, and in particular from a growing body of animal research pointing to influences on the first 1,000 days of life that extend much further back in time to the preconception years well before becoming a parent. This broadens our thinking really as to what it means to promote a healthy start to life. It suggests that intervening post-conception may simply be too late, and that the DOHAD framework should be extended to include studies of preconception or intergenerational origins of health and disease as well. And what is meant by the preconception period has widened dramatically in recent history too. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, for example, first births typically happen in the mid to late teens. Now the median age of first-time mothers in Australia is approaching 32 years of age. And that's consistent across other developed economies as well. And this is important demographic change because this vastly extended preconception period coincides with other major secular changes in lifestyle that might influence the environments that parents can provide their offspring. And these include things like higher rates of depression, anxiety, substance use, increasing rates of obesity and related metabolic disorders. They also include new expectations too, that parents will meet the financial, the educational, and the emotional support needs of their children well into early adulthood. So we have a different landscape. Most preconception work to date has focused on the intergenerational origins of physical health problems, including stunting and metabolic problems and so forth. Much, much less is known about the preconception origins of economic, emotional, relational problems, including socioeconomic disadvantage, parent mental health problems, parent-child attachment difficulties, and child mood and behaviour problems. Opportunities to study preconception pathways are exceedingly rare too, because there remain very few examples of cross-generational cohort studies in the world. And this means that in all cases, preconception social determinants remain unclear, which severely limits options for public health and clinical responses to breaking these entrenched cycles of risk. So the ANZ Australia, New Zealand, ICC, was established to directly address this gap in knowledge by bringing together three of the oldest longitudinal studies of health and development in our region. And the oldest of these is the Dunedin Multidisciplinary Health and Development Study, which has followed just over 1,000 participants and their families from birth to adulthood across 14 waves since 1972, and 730 cohort offspring in early childhood since 1994. The next is the Australian Temperament Project Generation 3 study, which has followed just over 2,000 participants and their families from infancy to adulthood across 15 waves since 1983, and just over 1,100 offspring from pregnancy to early childhood since 2012. And the final in the set is the Victorian Intergenerational Health Cohort Study, which has followed a cohort of just over 1,900 young people from adolescence to adulthood across 10 waves since 1992, and just over 1,000 offspring from pregnancy to early childhood since 2006. That study has actually just entered the adolescent years as well, which is another remarkable achievement. The striking thing, I think, about each of these cohorts is the extraordinary effort that has gone into collecting each wave of offspring cohort data, with each wave typically taking around 6 years to complete, requiring twice yearly contact of the entire cohort to identify pregnancies, and costing, I think, conservatively around $1 million per wave. So they're very big investments, these intergenerational studies. They take a lot of work and a lot of resourcing. But the dividends from these impressive efforts, though, are really beginning to shine through as rare insights into the way experiences of one generation can get passed on to the next, and in doing so, establish highly stable cycles of both strengths and difficulties. A fact that I find interesting is that despite being led by different groups in different areas over many decades, ICC cohorts share striking similarities in study design and collectively pool data from around 5,000 parents who are the original cohort participants, and around 3,000 next generation offspring. So timing of the waves across preconception and next generation follow-up assessments are well aligned. And in all cohorts, attrition over time has been low at around 1% per year, with ascertainment of next generation offspring sitting at around above 90%. And this provides, a very robust epidemiological foundation for addressing key intergenerational research questions. ICC cohorts also share striking similarities in study instrumentation. So preconception assessments align across mental health, across substance misuse, traumatic life events, socioeconomic disadvantage, as well as a broad range of indicators of positive development as well. So we can look at both strengths and vulnerabilities. Next generation offspring assessments align as well across parental mental health, parent-child relationship quality, and child behaviour. The cohorts also have various forms of genome and epigenome-wide genotyping, which we're not going to get into here, but offer great opportunities for studying genetic inheritance in time as well. Okay, so these remarkable alignments have made it possible to work across all three cohorts, and with the aim of examining the extent to which preconception depressive symptoms, substance misuse, traumatic life events, socioeconomic disadvantage, and positive development predict three major features of life for the next generation. And the first is continuities of parent mental health and substance use into pregnancy and into child raising. The next is the quality of the parent-child relationship, and also how child development is emerging with respect to mood and behaviour. So these are our three core research questions that we've been focusing on as outcomes in the next generation. Most of our work to date has used what we call a target trial methodology, which is based on the principles of causal modelling within observational data, to identify targets for policy investment and community action. However, we've also conducted non-causal descriptive analyses to identify risk groups for priority attention. We've used a variety of modelling approaches too, including pooling for power when sample is too low in any one cohort, replicating findings across cohorts to strengthen confidence in findings when we do have power in individual cohorts, and building an extended understanding by undertaking sequential analyses on a common theme. An important caveat we always like to say with this work is that the findings we will now present are at a population level only. They don't indicate risk at an individual level, and in doing so, they uniquely inform population approaches to intergenerational health. All right, so we thought it might be most useful to present a high-level digest of findings from this ICC to date as a series of did you know facts to encourage reflection on how our histories impact the present and the future in ways that can be as powerful, if not more so, than current life circumstances. So Kim will walk us through a set of did you know facts around preconception determinants of parental mental health and substance use on becoming parents. Primrose will then walk us through a further set of did you know facts around preconception determinants of the quality of parent-child relationships and intergenerational impacts on social and emotional development of the child. So, Kim, I'll hand over to you now. I'll control the slide for you, so just let me know what you need. Can you see that okay?
I can see it, and can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, nice and clear.
Yep. Perfect. Well, thank you again for the invitation to present. It's a pleasure to be here today and a pleasure to be a part of the ICC research team. So what we've been able to find by comparing patterns across these intergenerational cohorts is that many of the outcomes that we see in children's early environments can be traced back to the experiences of parents before they ever had children, and possibly even before they ever thought of becoming parents. So to turn first to mental health, at one time there was a belief that perinatal depression was a discrete condition that can happen to anyone without any previous warning or symptoms. But the ICC data actually suggests that for the majority of parents, perinatal depression is a continuation of mental health problems with onsets well before pregnancy. Our research, just as an example, identified 85% of women and 68% of men who experienced postnatal depression had a history of depression starting from their own adolescence, and this translates into about a 5-fold increase in risk. This research also identified that adolescents and young adults with personality disorders and those who have experienced sexual abuse have increased risks of perinatal depressive symptoms. We've also investigated the early origins of perinatal substance use, so looking at tobacco, cannabis, and alcohol use during pregnancy and immediately following pregnancy. And similarly, we've identified very clear preconception patterns again. So to use binge drinking as one example, our research showed that pregnant individuals who reported weekly binge drinking in adolescence had 3 times the odds of alcohol use in pregnancy, even after finding out that they were pregnant. And when we look at smoking, 90% of those who smoked during the perinatal period had been smoking at least weekly since their adolescence. We also wanted to mention that this research identifies protective factors. So you'll see that text in the green here on this slide. So as examples, low emotionality and for men, secure attachment to parents and peers both predicted lower perinatal depressive symptoms. And just to reiterate some advantages of these study designs that Craig was mentioning, these are prospectively collected data. So the studies aren't asking adults to remember what their experiences were in adolescence. The data are collected in that moment. Also, we're able to pool data across cohorts, and that allowed us to look at very low prevalence outcomes, such as substance use during pregnancy. And then overall, being able to triangulate the data and look across the studies, we found remarkable consistency in these patterns, which gives us confidence that those patterns we're seeing are really there. So I'll turn it over next to Primrose. Thanks.
Thanks, Kim. That was a great overview. And all of those facts are published papers that people can access if they would like to. We can make those available as well if you want to know more. Primrose, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here as well on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I'm going to provide an overview from the Intergenerational Cohort Consortium of preconception factors that influence the quality of parent-child relationships to start with. So considering parents who growing up had a history of depression during their teenage years, our research shows that this early experience can affect how they bond with their own children after birth. So the challenges they faced in their formative years may echo into their new role as parents, which highlights the profound long-term impact of adolescent mental health. Considering another scenario, children growing up in disadvantaged environments. These children, when they become parents, are at high risk of encountering bonding issues with their newborns. This connection underscores the enduring influence of early adversity and the importance of addressing these issues early on. The trauma from child and adolescent sexual abuse is another critical factor. Our work in preparation indicates that such experiences can moderately increase the risk of bonding problems in the next generation, suggesting a need for targeted support for survivors as they transition to parenthood. We've also found that insecure bonds between parents and their children can lead to high risk of bonding problems in the next generation. This finding emphasises the importance of fostering secure attachments early in life to break this cycle. Additionally, physical illness and self-harm during young adulthood are risks which are associated with a moderate risk of next generation bonding, postnatal bonding issues, showing the complex interplay between physical health, mental health, and parenting. Interestingly, the quality of adolescent relationships has a significant impact on later parenting confidence. This is the finding in the green. So strong, healthy relationships during adolescence can enhance future parenting self-efficacy, accounting for a notable 33% of the variance, which really highlights the ripple effects of positive adolescent experiences. Thanks, Craig. And we're just moving on now to health and development outcomes for the next generation. Depression in boys when they're teenagers and young adults is linked to a reduction in gestational age of their offspring by about 5 days. Similarly, daily cannabis use during adolescence is associated with a 1-week reduction in gestational age. These findings suggest that substance use and mental health of young men may have direct implications for their future children's early development. For women, the impact of depression during the teen and young adult years may extend beyond pregnancy. Depression during these formative years is associated with a higher risk of having young children with behaviour problems, both internalising and externalising. Youth depression also doubles the odds of increased stress reactivity years later in offspring, which highlights the intergenerational transmission of mental health problems. On a more positive note, positive development before parenthood during adolescence and young adulthood predicts many years later child social emotional competencies and reduced behaviour problems. And although this protective effect is relatively small, it suggests that promoting strengths may secure a healthier start to life. So just in summary, our findings illuminate the profound impact that mental health, childhood experiences and adolescent behaviours have on the next generation, and they point to a range of early life experiences that could be directly mitigated through preventive intervention strategies. But we do need more work to understand mechanisms, including how to offset risk once factors such as these have become established. Thank you.
All right, thanks Primrose and Kim for giving us that high-level overview. I noticed some comments in the chat asking for access to the papers. We will be preparing a research brief. So each of these presentations, webinars will be accompanied by a research brief, which will give an overview of the did you know facts and provide all the references as well that people can access to look at these things in more detail. So there are many more analyses yet to be conducted in this consortium. So this is really just the tip of the iceberg of what we hope the ICC will be able to provide going forward. The main message here is that the effects of depression, substance use, medical and sexual trauma and social disadvantage need not be limited to one generation alone. They can spill over and they can modify the foundations of a healthy start to life in the next generation. So the big question from here is what all this means on the ground and how do we want to use findings like these to create population health benefits in communities. Already findings from the ICC have been picked up in policy documents around the world, which is one important way findings from our cohort studies are making a difference in the world. However, because this is a translation pathway that we as researchers often don't have much control over, We've also been exploring other mechanisms of bringing findings from cohorts to life in the world. And we've become particularly interested in a very old community-based participatory research framework that was first described in 1946 by a Polish sociologist by the name of Kurt Lewin, who is actually the mentor and supervisor of Urie Bronfenbrenner, who's the father of modern social ecological theory, so a very significant thinker in the history of social epidemiology. And in this approach is distinctly place-based and focuses on bottom-up translation processes embedded in community, government and research partnerships. And the community-based participatory research approach is about empowering communities to collect their own local data with which to advocate for place-based service system reform, but to do so in ways that could potentially create generational change requires access to high-quality population data spanning the formative years of childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, just prior to the normative transitions to parenthood in populations. At the moment, the best developmental data we have that could be provided to communities at the population level are currently drawn from a patchwork of data from many survey sources, measuring a range of different outcomes that do not always connect developmentally and that mostly focus on particular ages and stages of development. So to provide a more streamlined measurement system for communities, we've been building and testing a new, what we call comprehensive monitoring system that spans childhood to young adulthood from birth to 24 years across a series of 7 population census surveys, each separated by 3 yearly intervals, so birth, age 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, and a final one at age 24 years of age. The system has been designed to extend the reach of the Australian Early Development Census and has been built in collaboration with the Victorian Department of Education AEDC team headed by Kathy Nolan. For those not familiar with the AEDC, this is one of our most impressive national population monitoring achievements. It's a triennial population survey that monitors over 300,000 children on transition to school across all states and territories of Australia, with response rates in excess of 90%. It's been going since 2009, and I'm looking at Kim here because it was brought in from Canada and adapted for use in Australia here. So there are equivalent data in Canada. The extended census system we have designed here is a developmentally sequenced set of indicators based on findings from 50 years of research within Australia and New Zealand longitudinal studies, including recent intergenerational findings from our ICC work. The system is intentionally strengths-based, and it measures physical, relational, emotional, cognitive, and existential development of children and young people, as well as including indicators of the major social ecologies that shape development over time, with a particular focus on family, peer, school, digital, and community microsystems. Data linkage is then used to complete a picture of the formative years by bringing in wider contextual information. In 2021, we trialled community-led implementation of all 7 census surveys simultaneously around the time of the last AEDC in 3 rural local government areas in northern Victoria. To ensure sustainable implementation, we embedded survey delivery within 3 universally funded government platforms. So Maternal Child Health Services were responsible for the infant and toddler census surveys. Schools administered the middle childhood and adolescent census surveys, and the local learning and employment network in each of the local government areas handled our young adult census survey. And for us, this trial was akin to breaking the 3-minute mile. Few believed it could be done, and we did wonder too. But I'm happy to report that the results were outstanding, and particularly so given that we were working in the tail end of COVID-19 restrictions that made the trial a particularly strenuous one. Response rates were high, with the exception of our Year 12 survey, which was disrupted by COVID. And this to us showed it was possible to empower communities to collect their own data with which to advocate for social change in areas. It demonstrated the power of bottom-up collective action approaches to data collections when the right measurement tools were made available to communities. It connected universal services in ways they'd never connected before to support the full early life course from childhood to young adulthood, just prior to transitions to parenthood. And it's also had this interesting contagion effect whereby other local government areas now both nearby and further afield, have put up their hands to participate in the next cycle of implementation, which is really encouraging to see. Data from these collections have been made available to leaders in communities, leaders of each of the universal platforms, through a user-friendly interactive data visualization tool that we built to display the data. And this can be accessed by community leads at any time to guide decision-making and planning. We've also augmented the system with an online menu of evidence-based services based on a living systematic review of the global literature on evidence-based population approaches to promoting mental health and wellbeing from birth to 24 years. The menu now includes over 100 evidence-based programs, all suitable for population application in communities, in schools, and in community health centres. And so collectively, what we've been able to put in place, in addition to policy impacts, is a very different sort of activity. So our findings informing top-down processes through policy, as well as bottom-up processes embedded in community, government, and research partnerships. So hopefully this brief overview of our intergenerational program provides you at least some sense of what we've been doing within our most mature cohorts, and also how we've been thinking about bringing to life findings from these studies to break cycles of risk in partnership with communities. If there was one message I would want to leave with you, it's that the collective wisdom of all of our cohorts is clearly saying that every age and stage matters across the formative years of development, and that we can't afford to drop the ball at any one point from early childhood to young adulthood without consequences within and across generations. But I also wanted to acknowledge before finishing that much of what we've been able to put data to in this work has been said before, particularly in Indigenous cultures in Australia and around the world. And I want to leave you with a powerful quote from the North American Iroquois Constitution that beautifully captures the importance of maintaining a focus on future generations. And it says, "Look and listen for the welfare of the whole population and have always in view not only the present, but also the coming generations, even those whose faces are yet beneath the surface of the ground, the unborn of the future nation. In our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations." Thank you. And thank you, Primrose and Kim. And we look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Craig and Primrose and Kimberly. We've got a few questions that have come through. Primrose, this one Lauren has just asked, when you were talking about relationships between adolescents and their parents, Lauren's asked if there's relationship quality with other adolescents being asked or considered as part of that.
Yeah, I'm not sure which particular study she's referring to, but in our work we have looked at relationship quality in different ways. So sometimes we've looked in the first generation, the parent-child relationship quality, but also peer relationship qualities. So some of our work has definitely included that. And then the outcome has been the parent-child relationship quality in the sort of early childhood years. So
Great.
I think that clarifies that.
I think that's definitely where Lauren was going. Craig, while you were speaking, someone has asked, how generalisable would these be at a state or territory population level, especially being that one of the inputs is from Victoria?
So is that question directed to the Australian Early Development Census surveillance work, or?
It was when you were talking about the way that you're working within communities.
Within communities, okay. Well, I suppose we're committed to the idea of place-based measurement, so that communities could create a map of their own local area with its own unique risk and protective profile and its own unique developmental outcomes. So we're very much in our thinking taking a place-based approach. Now, findings from one local government area would not necessarily generalise to other local government areas. There'll be unique profiles by areas. So if that's where the question's going, then you couldn't, from the Northern Victorian populations, for example, presume that you had caught the pulse of the state or the nation. This would have to be done more broadly beyond that. But we are really trying to take our eye right down to place and to provide on the ground information for local decision makers to make decisions that are congruent with what is going on with their young populations at the time. But theoretically, if this sort of the contagion spread and lots of, all government areas were to do it, we would have an incredible map of Australia forming just from place-based bottom-up processes.
That's great. So what would you say the benefits have been of bringing this cross-cohort data together?
Kim, do you want to have a shot at that?
Sure. And I was thinking of this for the segment that I led as well. I mean, being able to pool data to look at rare outcomes is a huge one. Being able to triangulate data to see the same patterns across different cohort studies done in different parts of Australia and New Zealand. Yeah, so these are the two that I think are really strong. And I'll say from Canada, we don't have anything comparable to this, these intergenerational cohorts, as Craig was mentioning, the amount of effort that goes into collecting this data prospectively. We can sort of hack it together with linked data, but I think it's really rare what you have in Australia and New Zealand. And just, I think what we've spoken to sort of points to the richness of the research that can happen when you collect data prospectively across 3 generations.
And I think just adding to that, Kim, too, like most people, when they think of cross-cohort work, they do think of pooling data, harmonizing data, pooling data, and that's kind of where people start from. But certainly within our studies, there have been opportunities where studies themselves have had sufficient sample size and statistical power to run models in and of themselves. And then what we've been able to do in that case is try to replicate those findings across the 3 cohorts. And that just strengthens our confidence in those findings. But I think the one that really interests me the most is where we might see a study might be uniquely poised to tell us something about preconception, childhood, life, preconception as a child, another in adolescence, another in young adulthood. And across the 3 studies, we can tell an integrated story of development. And so that there are a lot of really important ways of looking at these. And Meredith O'Connor in the first webinar series and colleagues at our clinical epidemiology and biostats unit at the Murdoch Children's have put together 2 papers that really explore these different ways of using cohorts collectively. And those papers we can make available too for people who are interested to know more.
That's great. So we probably will go to our last question now, and we've got a lot of interest in the data that you've presented today, but how can we access the consortium's data?
So if people want to run analyses or do analyses within the multi-cohort data environment that we've created, I think, Primrose, the best way would be just to make direct contact with us. We have a paper proposal template which allows people to specify the nature of their question, what data they have, and we can start a process of developing up analyses, supporting those analyses, and providing access to data to complete them and publish them. So we really would encourage people who are interested in this space to be in touch because we really want these data to be used as widely as they possibly can be. This is what we've produced as a small team over a couple of years. There's a lot more that we can do. That's
great. Thank you so much. So thanks everyone for joining us today for our second in the Longitudinal Studies Collaborative Webinar Series for this year. Keep an eye out for the next one, which is scheduled for October, with a look into the research being conducted on the health impacts of homelessness for youth. We're looking forward to you joining us then to discover more insights into the unique data that is being collected across Australia's cross-cohort collaborations of longitudinal studies. So the recording of today's session will be made available on the Eracy website and YouTube channel, and as Craig said, we'll have a research brief to accompany. If you aren't already, subscribe to Eracy's newsletter to be kept up to date with news, events and future webinars, and we'll also include the link to the recordings in our newsletters. So we're going to bring this event to a close. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you all at our next webinar. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.